These lectures on the Orisha religion are meant to accompany the reading that is assigned for this unit on the Orisha religion. That material came from my publication, Spirits, Blood, and Drums, the Orisha religion in Trinidad. If you'd like to own the full text, you can find it in many places online. What I'll do here is I will go through the reading chapter by chapter. It starts with chapter 1, and then, as you noted, it jumped to chapter 12 and basically finishes out the book, covering chapters 13 and 14. And so I will just hit the high points, what I consider to be the most important information in each chapter. Of course, the reading is assigned for a reason. There is virtually no way you will understand what's going on here if you don't carefully do the reading. So please, obviously, do the reading. This is just meant to be an aid to help you understand what's going on. It starts with chapter 1. And in chapter 1, excuse me, in chapter 1, basically I review my fieldwork experiences, just to give the reader some idea what it's like to do fieldwork in a different land amongst people speaking that worship a different religion. The very first episode I discussed is actually about culture shock, which I experienced as a result of what went on there in that church. And of course you read about it. I found the quote-unquote possession experience to be quite disturbing because, before this time I'd assume this is sort of a ritualized, perfunctory type of experience. But I never imagined that it was quote-unquote real. And of course we addressed that in my last lecture, what it means when I say they're real. They're true dissociative experiences, not possessions by spiritual entities as they claim. But nevertheless, it was pretty shocking, and that was a very sort of shocking introduction, I guess you could say, to my fieldwork on the Orisha religion. I also discuss the way that I actually end up meeting one of my key contacts, Aaron. And I first saw him in Woodford Square, as you read. And of course I got into a bit of trouble. I broke a number of cultural rules, none of which I was familiar with at the time because I hadn't been in Trinidad very long. But Aaron was kind of amused by it. And later we struck up a conversation and it took off from there, and he ended up helping me quite a bit with my field work. So please read those comments. That's one of the ways that field work is done. It can be rather opportunistic and accidental, so to speak. Then I discussed my spiritual Baptist initiation, and by now you should know why my work on the Orisha religion involved a spiritual Baptist initiation. That's kind of like a first step in becoming an Orisha worshiper. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But that was, you read all about the spiritual Baptist baptism, and that was followed by my initiation in the Orisha religion, which is the single, I guess, most significant event in regard to lessening the social distance between myself and the people I worked with. After my initiation, I could essentially do everything else any other Orisha worshiper could do, including play the drums, which I did quite a few times. Toward the end of that chapter 1, I do allude to the importance of the emic approach, or an emic approach, E-M-I-C. That is taking the insider's perspective as opposed to etic, E-T-I-C, which is the outsider's perspective. And I learned that without a full account of the native's perspective, then we can never really truly and holistically understand what's going on. And good anthropology is a merging of etic observations and emic observations. And that's the point of the comments I make toward the end of chapter 1. Okay, then we move to chapter 12. This is really the sort of analysis part of my work. Chapter 12 addresses the open system characteristic of the Orisha religion, meaning that it did not begin as a closed, complete system. There were lots of gaps, we call them lacunae, lots of theological gaps in the religion. And that's because there was an incomplete transference of the religion from Nigeria. Not everyone in Nigeria participated in the work and worship of all the different Orisha at all the different shrines. So what you have is a hodgepodge of memories that people stitched together in an attempt to recreate and perpetuate their religion in Trinidad. But nevertheless, it was an incomplete form of their religion. So there was some borrowing that was done from other religious systems in order to fill these gaps. As I noted in chapter 12, such borrowing would generally be free of redundancy, meaning that it doesn't make sense to borrow an element or a trait that's already present in the current system. So borrowing and syncretism usually will avoid redundancy. And I talk about the Kabbalah and the spiritual Baptists in this context. So consider the Kabbalah, for example. Some Orisha worshippers do participate in Kabbalah worship. They've made it part of their system. But if you read carefully, you'll note that they take pains to keep the Kabbalah separate and independent from Orisha worship. So with the Kabbalah, what we have is sort of like a juxtaposition of religious traits. And they do avoid redundancy because the elements of the Kabbalah religion are not found in the Orisha system. But as I said, because of other issues, namely the feeling that the Kabbalah is demonic, quote unquote, on the part of some Orisha worshippers, and they feel as if it should be kept separate from the more pure, pristine Orisha system. Anyway, so the presence of the Kabbalah system in Orisha religion is more of a juxtaposition than an assimilation or integration or syncretism. Now, the spiritual Baptist case is different. The spiritual Baptist traits that are borrowed actually accentuate and add to the Orisha religious system. There's no redundancy involved. In fact, the spiritual Baptist faith is thought to be sort of a training ground for the Orisha religion. So a person would first engage with spiritual Baptist powers, as they call them, and plant spiritual Baptist flags and so forth before they go the full-blown Orisha route, as that's discussed in the text. So the spiritual Baptist religion is thought to be sort of a training ground for the more powerful Orisha religious system. And there is no redundancy involved there. Now, chapter 13, I get into Catholicism because it deserves a separate chapter because it's so important. Not because of Catholicism per se, but because of what they did with Catholicism. Now, the syncretism involved here, remember syncretism is the combining of disparate traits, culturally disparate traits, and they combine to make a totally new trait. Well, clearly the Catholic syncretism, or the borrowing, does involve redundancy. In fact, the Africans in Trinidad are equating certain Catholic saints with certain African Orisha. And they equate them because they're thought to be the same or similar. So, for example, there's an African god of this, and then there's a saint who simply is the European form of that African god from their perspective. But even though this type of borrowing and syncretism is redundant, something that you would generally avoid, you need to remember, and I point out, that this was done under duress. This is a so-called directed contact situation. You have to go back to the mid-19th century, around 1850. European Catholics were the dominant, Europeans in general were the dominant population, and the Africans were just doing what they could do to survive. So this was done under duress. I'm guessing if you would take that element out of it, there probably would have been no Catholic syncretism. But you find this Catholic syncretism in virtually all the African-derived religions of the New World, including Voodoo, or what we call Voodoo, also Santeria, that you might have heard about. They all have this sort of Catholic flavor to them. And it's all because they were done under situations of duress and directed contact situations. Now, one indication that what I'm saying is plausible, namely that they only did this borrowing because they were under duress, is the Africanization movement. Because as the Africans gain more and more cultural independence in Trinidad, they have begun to quote-unquote Africanize their shrines, which in this case simply means dropping all of the Christian elements, most of which are Catholic. Some are spiritual Baptists, but most of which are Catholic. So many of the newer shrines of the younger people are African, purely African, without any Christian elements or Catholic elements at all. And as it turns out, according to my research, the older the shrine is, the higher the probability that the shrine is Catholicized with these Catholic elements. So that shows you the strength and the importance of the Africanization movement that is currently occurring. Chapter 14, I talk about the transmission of religious knowledge, and this is really important when you are trying to analyze and explain the transformation of a religious system. And of course, this is a religious system that is highly transformative, especially if you start with 1850 and move up to today. All of these things have happened in only about 170 years. So this is a religion that is really in its infancy. And please note this, all religions in their infancy are syncretic. they all borrow from other religions. No religion just appears wholly made out of a vacuum. They're all the results of historical accidents and borrowing and some syncretism, etc. All right, so the transmission of knowledge in the Orisha religion. The first couple of pages in chapter 14, I do go over the different transmission types. As it turns out, the primary transmission of knowledge in Trinidad occurs in a one-to-many, oblique fashion. One-to-many means the transmission of knowledge occurs when one person, or let's say a small number of people, are transmitting knowledge to a large number of people. And in this case, it's the Mongbas and Iyas. You saw those words. Mongba, the male priest, Iyas are the female priestesses in the religion. They are primarily the ones, along with some elders, that are transmitting the religious knowledge to the next generation. So one to many, and then the oblique simply refers to a person of one generation transferring information to someone of a later generation that's not in their family. So the one to many oblique transmission modality is the one that is prevalent in the Orisha religion. So that has to be taken into consideration, because if you think about it, that type of transmission of knowledge gives us the highest probability of big changes occurring in only one generation. Because after all, if only a handful of people are transmitting all the information to the next generation, then this small handful of people has a lot of control over the information that's transmitted. The second thing we need to address here is the mourning ritual, M-O-U-R-I-N-G. This is a sort of a typical spiritual travels kind of ritual where a person is quote-unquote put down, their head and their ears and their eyes are wrapped, much like mine were during my initiation. And the point is to send them on spiritual travels. And during these travels, they'll have a variety of experiences, sometimes interaction with particular Orisha. At the end of this experience, they're quote-unquote brought up, and then they will testify publicly. In other words, at a public service, they will tell people what happened to them during their travels. And typically, they will receive instructions regarding how they should conduct a feast, maybe which particular Orisha they should be worshiping, how this Orisha should be worshipped, and so forth. So you can see there is the possibility for an individual to quote-unquote put their stamp on the religion, to introduce all kinds of new and novel information. As you read in the text, there are some safeguards to keep this process from getting out of control. But nevertheless, this is a very personal, subjective, existential experience. And the result of that is that people sometimes are adding new and novel things to Orisha worship. Now, if you combine that with the fact that only a small handful of people are transmitting information, you get a powerful force for change. So, for example, if the transmitters of knowledge are undergoing mourning, here you have just a few individuals, many of them with their own individual experiences and instructions, passing this information down to the next generation. I think you can see how this would be a huge influence on change in the religion.